So, this is the story of how my roommates turned my apartment into a crack house and ruined my life. All the events in the story are true. Names have not been changed to protect the guilty, which means it might actually be possible to dox the people involved, including me. Please don't. This is going to take a while to write out, so please be patient. No, I'm not going to pre-write it. You get it as it emerges, Venus-like, from my forehead. So, I was living in this one bedroom apartment in which I had turned the living room into a bedroom with a sort of Tetris wall of boxes, wall units, and cabinets. My last roommate, who had the bedroom, had moved out, and I needed a new roommate, one who wouldn't be too bothered by not having a living room, and who would respect my privacy, which was protected by a curtain hung from a pool cue taped to the top of the Tetris wall. Before I talk about my new roommates, I should probably mention a bit about the one who was leaving. My old roommate's name was Fred. I've known Fred for a long time, and he was a reasonably good roommate, but he had some quirks. Fred grew up in a family where the father brought home food for himself, which he referred to as private stock, and food for everyone else, which was then thrown out into the world for everyone to fight over. If you didn't want to starve, you had to do daily combat to get the best stuff, with everyone squirreling away whatever they could get for days when the battle went poorly. One day, I discovered an awesome sale on cheese crackers at the supermarket. I got 4 huge 5-pound boxes of cheese crackers for $1 a piece. I showed Fred and stacked them in the kitchen. My policy was always that people are free to take what food they like from me. I then replace it however many times they eat it, so that they never feel the need to steal. They know it'll always be there for them. Oddly, Fred seemed angry when I brought home the cheese crackers. I couldn't figure out why. For the next several days, I kept finding the boxes of cheese crackers scattered across the kitchen, like they had been kicked. Can any of you see how all of this is related, and what was about to happen, and why this was about to lose me my roommate? If so, you're a better man than I, because I didn't figure it out until later. One day, about a week after I had brought home the cheese crackers, Fred flung aside my curtain and announced, proudly, that he was finally done. He had eaten all of the cheese crackers. You see, it turns out that what Fred's family had done was make it impossible for him to share. It wasn't that he was afraid he wouldn't get any, he was afraid that someone else might. So my policy of simply replacing whatever my roommate ate, so that he wouldn't feel the need to steal, meant he was forced to eat more and more food in a vain attempt to try to keep it all for himself. And when I bought the 20 pounds of cheese crackers which he didn't even like, he was forced to spend the next week eating a diet of nothing but cheese crackers, grimly crunching through bag after bag, until they were gone. Enraged at what I was doing to him, finally, nauseated from cheese crackers and 50 pounds overweight from living with me, he announced he was moving out. It took a while and a lot of discussions, but I eventually figured out what I just explained to you, and how I had accidentally made Fred obese, sick, and unhealthy, and why I needed a new roommate. So, now I needed a new roommate. I had a good friend who was a panhandler, and I'd known him for a few years. He had recently broken up with his girlfriend, who had cheated on him, and she was homeless. I knew her, but not well, and I felt badly for her. She was a petite little thing, formed 11 something like 90 pounds, so I didn't think I was putting myself at any risk. I invited her to move in with me and set down a few ground rules. For example, I knew she smoked pot occasionally. I have asthma, and I asked that she smoke her pot outside. She agreed, and I figured it was a win-win situation for everyone. She had a stable place to live, my friend didn't have to feel guilty about kicking her cheating ass to the curb, and I got a new roommate who was a girl. I mean, girls make good roommates, right? And she wasn't going to eat a quarter of her body weight in cheese crackers. I'm a professionally published writer. Lovecraftian mythos horror mostly. It's the closest thing to my personal life experience. And yes, in retrospect, I've done wiser things. But she was this tiny little slip of a girl. I didn't think she could do any harm. So, anyway, Rowan her name. No kidding, and her pet pug moved in. The second day she was there, she asked me to go for a walk. I went with her. She took me to meet her crack dealer, bought a giant rock, took it home, and smoked it in her room right in front of me, staring at me the whole time. At the time, I was baffled. I wondered if I had done something to offend her. Now I realize of course that she was silently telling me that this is how it was going to be, and that I had to throw her out now or forever hold my peace. I suggested gently to her that, while it was none of my business what she put in her body, she had agreed to smoke outside. She agreed that she would smoke outside from now on as she blazed up her crack pipe and she was all friendly again. I didn't quite know what to make of it. You know how they always talk about how neat girls are as roommates? Well, they're lying. In the entire time Ryan lived there, about a year and a half, she didn't do laundry once. What she would do is wear clothes until they were ragged, then she'd strip them off and throw them in a corner and replace them with new clothes she boosted from department stores. The old, stinky clothes would just gather in drifts, on top of which she would lift her bed and furniture, like a rising tide of old, raggedy fabric. By the time she left, the floor was 2.5 feet high in the middle, and right to the ceiling in the corners. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, there was Mike. Mike was the dude Ryan had cheated on my friend with. Actually, it turns out that my friend had cheated on Ryan with Mike too. But that's an entirely different story. When Ryan moved in with me, Mike was in jail, which is why Ryan was homeless. Ryan spent all her money on crack and pot. She smoked an average of 10 to 15 grams of chronic a day, so she never had any money left for anything else, and lived with a succession of sugar daddies. Rowan, you understand, dressed like a little girl. She was extremely petite, so she could wear children's sizes and could pass for 12 if she could hide her face. Her face was hard. She was in her mid-20s, but her face looked middle-age. She had been ridden hard and put away wet an awful lot, and she walked around with the portrait of Dorian Gray in her face. But a petite, childlike body meant she rarely had trouble finding sugar daddies, and she milked it for all it was worth. 2 months after Rowan moved in, Mike got out of jail. This was the choice I was given. I could allow Mike to move in which case, they would share their room and split their half of the rent, and I would pay the other half. Or, she could move out. I could accept Mike as my new roommate, or she could simply move out without notice and leave me screwed. I decided to let Mike and Rowan move in together with me. I dunno. A lot of this stuff seems pretty obvious in retrospect, but my personal philosophy is that if you treat someone with respect, they will be respectable. If you treat someone with trust, they will be trustworthy. People tend to live up or down to your expectations. And as horrible as a lot of the results have been, there have been incredible successes too, where people no one else has ever trusted have found the self-respect to live up to what I saw in them. And honestly, I think it probably makes up for all the rest. Anyway, to continue, Mike is a charming, friendly, fit, physically attractive sociopath with twinkling eyes and an open, infectious smile. He is also heavily addicted to heroin. I saved his life once. He cooked up an entire 3-day fentanyl patch and shot it into his arm. His lips turned blue and he stopped breathing. Rowan couldn't do anything but shriek and violently shake his shoulders around so his head flew everywhere. I kept him breathing and called 911. He actually snuck out of the hospital a few hours later and returned home because he didn't want to waste the rest of his buzz by having it chemically counteracted. But once again I get ahead of myself. So, Mike gets out of jail and makes a beeline for my apartment. He and Rowan shack up together, and for a while all is fine. Until the toilet. Oh god, the toilet. I don't know what to tell you, guys. I witnessed it myself. I'm not lying. If she didn't get at least 6 grams a day, she would flip out. She often smoked it with hash tar, too. You wouldn't believe how much shake ended up in our apartment. Whole garbage bags full, which she and Mike would boil down for the hash oil. They were prodigious users. In fact, maybe I better take some time to talk about the drugs. Rowan was into up and psychedelics mostly, coke, crack, shrooms, and with the chronic being used to bring her down. Mike, on the other hand, mostly into down, smack, fentanyl, oxys, whatever. When the two of them moved in together, however, they combined their habits. The both of them began using up and down, though they mostly dropped the psychedelics at that point. The massive amounts of pot and hash were what kept them sane. I think being cranked on crack and heroin at the same time makes you completely fucking insane. He got her shooting up, and she got him smoking crack. I don't know how much they were using of the other stuff, but she worked a full-time job as a baker, and he worked the equivalent of 2 full-time jobs boosting, and they were still always completely broke. So, life with Mike and Rowan. Always Mike and Rowan, never Rowan and Mike. You knew who wore the pants in this family. Wasn't exactly fun, but it was tolerable at first. They never did dishes, ever. As mentioned before, neither one of them ever did laundry. When the clothes they were wearing wore out, they'd get tossed on the floor and forgotten about forever. They'd have done the same thing with the dishes if didn't wash them myself when the sink and counter filled up completely. Still, as you know from my previous postings, I've lived with worse. Then one day the toilet plugged. I noticed for a day or two that it wasn't flushing properly, and I bought liquid plumber and a plunger. That worked for a while, but eventually it just stopped working entirely. I couldn't call maintenance because our apartment looked like something from Hoarders at this point, and there were burnt spoons and needles and giant bags of shake and huge bubbling glass columns of hash and whatnot everywhere. No amount of plunging would fix the toilet, so I told them to use the toilet at the nearby restaurant for now while I tried to scrape up some money to buy a snake. They of course had no money, and I was paying for all the utilities because, well, they just wouldn't pay. Said I didn't tell them they had to when they moved in, so screw me. Anyway, you can probably guess what's coming. They did not stop using the toilet. It didn't flush, but they didn't care. They just kept filling the bowl. All their crackhead friends came over, and they used it too, until eventually it filled the bowl, filled to the rim, with shit and piss. Then, and I do not kid you, they began squatting on the rim so that they could pile the turd sundae right over the top, like squeezing in that last bit of slushy over the top of cup. I ended up having to get a soup ladle and spoon out all the shit into the bathtub. It had the consistency of porridge, and it wasn't so much the smell which made me gag but the sound of it, the wet, swampy, suction noise the ladle made as it bailed out the toilet, like a spoon wedging up jello. I could hear every moist crackle as I emptied the shit sundae into the tub. I will never forget that sound. To this day I can't pull my boot out of mud without retching from the sound. It just went on and on and on. Since a ladle isn't very big and there was a fucking mountain of crackhead shit. When I finally got the level low enough that I could use the snake, I discovered that some very bright person had been flushing needles down the toilet, and this was what had created the jam. I think the toilet adventure is what marked the turning point, where my life became a nightmare. Thanks for the offer, but I like to think that sharing my experiences brings people together emotionally. It makes the weight of my misery a little less heavy by sharing it, and people get some entertainment value from my experience. I think money would lessen it somehow, but thank you for the offer. My name was on the lease. Theirs was not. I also should mention, since it becomes relevant at this point, that I suffer from severe and untreatable clinical depression. Once triggered, the only way I can get over it is to retreat into somewhere dark, private, quiet, and safe, do a lot of meditation, and wait for it to pass. No retreat, no passing. Unless and until I can find a way to rebalance myself, the depressive episode just goes on and on and on. After I spooned the shit back into the toilet, load after load, cleaned and disinfected the tub, then removed all my clothes, because I and everything I was wearing had absorbed all the smell and I reeked like a crackhead's dirtiest pucker, I realized that they had no respect for me whatsoever. They regarded me as their meal ticket, if they regarded me at all. I decided at that point that I was no longer going to pick up after them. If the toilet filled with pudding again, it would stay that way. I'd buy a chemical camping toilet. I stopped washing the dishes, so the kitchen turned into a lumpy, green and grey biohazard area swarming with flies, beetles, and maggots. I retreated into my room and tried to stay there. Unfortunately, they took my retreat as surrender, at which point all the gloves came off and it got really bad. How bad? Well, let me tell you. Alright, I'm reaching the end. The next few months were mostly a blur for me. Remember, I slept in the living room with a Tetris wall and a curtain hanging from a pool cue for a door. By now, all their crackhead friends were coming over at all hours of the day or night. They kept their heroin in an empty Coke can. People could come in, pay for their spike, then nod off in a corner, curled up in the reeking drifts of ragged clothing. I woke up repeatedly to find people sneaking through my room, stealing stuff. Twice they went through my pockets and stole the rent. I started sleeping fully clothed, with a primer across my chest, out of terror that I'd be murdered in my sleep. I was too depressed to do anything but lie there for month after month while my whole life turned to a surreal, never-ending night where I couldn't wake up from. I'm asthmatic and the non-stop crack and meth smoke fogging the apartment gave me pneumonia which took 2 months to get rid of. I'm lucky to be alive. People all over the city started calling my apartment for their crack, heroin, and meth. They'd call collect front phone booths. I tried destroying the phone, and they just got their own and wired it into their room. I was now months behind on the rent. The power got turned off, and I was going to be homeless myself. Then, suddenly, Deus Ex Machina Mike was arrested. I had a chance. There's some stuff I'm leaving out because it could be used to personally identify me. I'm already walking the edge here. Someone with a brain could probably figure out who I am. I will just say that I am involved professionally in the same circles as a lot of these people, in a supportive role, and I find it hard not to give people a chance. Many times extending the hand of trust to someone who has never before been trusted brings out the best in them. The problem is, when it fails hard, and the cost is often terrible. So, Mike got busted for dealing, then he lied to the cop about having needles on him, and the cop jabbed himself with one of Mike's filthy used spikes. The cop ended up having to get all kinds of shots and tests, and Mike was not especially popular with the popo at this point. As a result, they threw the book at him and this time he was going to have to do some real time, probably at least a year. I saw a glimmer of hope and jumped at it. I got 6 large friends together and effected an illegal eviction on Rowan. We all grabbed shovels, shoveling all their belongings into trash bags. We used 120 that should give you some idea of how horrible the conditions had become, and throwing them outside the building. Unfortunately, the conditions in the apartment had become so bad that it really wasn't livable. I stayed another 2 months, but there was mold everywhere. The stench and grime was permanently ground into the walls, and I was still getting pounding on the door every 10 or 15 minutes from people looking for their fix. I ended up leaving the apartment and getting put on the provincial blacklist landlords maintain for problem tenants, which means I will never be able to rent an apartment again from any large landlord, or even any small, private one who pays for access to the list. Still, I'm alive, which is something to be grateful for after the experience. But the story isn't quite over. Okay, so the story is over. As much as any story about a life still occurring can be over. But there's a bit of an appendix to add here about the fate of Mike. When Mike goes to jail, he usually hoops enough junk to make his life pleasant while he's inside. Apparently Mike's rectum is legendary for its capaciousness. This time, because he was facing serious time, he needed to cram a very, very large amount inside himself. For those who are curious, he uses those little plastic balls that hold the toy inside those chocolate eggs. He was approached by some very serious people about muling a very large quantity inside, in exchange for being well taken care of while he did his time. Mike agreed, hooped something like $50K worth of products and was dropped off at the courthouse to turn himself in to serve his time. Except Mike decided it would be more fun to run away and spend 3 days using $50K worth of junk for the most epic party of his life. When they caught him, they packed him with even more junk to make up for their loss, then kept him overnight in a motel so they could watch him. The guy watching fell asleep and he took off again, then partied for a solid week on his bounty. Last I heard, he was still alive, but these are not the kind of men you want to rip off. Twice. I fully expect one day to read about him turning up in the river. I guess it's testament to his charm that he's not dead yet. I wanted to mention this because a few folks have implied that I'm an idiot for being fooled by him. I'm far from the only person taken in by his act. Sociopaths can be extremely charming when they want to be, and he has dimples like an angel. So, that's my story. Sorry it took so long and that there's no real resolution. But that's the way real life works. Thanks to everyone who stayed with me, and I hope my misery brought you a little joy. Since people have asked, I'll add a small appendix about myself. Yes, I had 2 subsequent bad roommate experiences, which I may relate at some later date. One of them was actually worse than this, believe it or not. Not quite as horrible in terms of sheer physical danger, but it did a lot more damage to my life. But as a result of that experience, I moved to another city where the economy is so depressed that I can afford to live in a small, bachelor apartment by myself. As servants wrote, happy the man to whom heaven has given a morsel of bread for which he is obliged to thank heaven alone. Good night, or good morning as applicable, and may you never have to experience these things firsthand. Never is enough, as my Canadian compadres, the Benedict ladies, would say. So I've recently moved Neckbeardia merch over to Teesprings and have a few new designs. Listings are below the video and in the description.
Just stop! Just stop it! Stop! No! Just stop it! It's time to stop! It's time to stop, okay? No more! Where the fuck are your parents? Who are your parents? I'm gonna call Child Protective Services. It's time to stop!